Love seeing all the diversity of folks zooming in from all across the country. Looking forward to seeing everyone activate the AAPI electorate in the coming weeks. We'll wait another minute or two. Folks are still coming in, just as a FYI. Feel free to introduce yourself in terms of what city and state you're zooming in from. As a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded, and all the items will be posted. The recording, as well as the crosstabs and the presentation, will be updated onto the website. And then throughout the webinar, you will be able to submit questions under the Q&A. Okay, wonderful. I think we will go ahead. Let me see if it stopped. Yeah, I think we could go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine Chen. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. We are so excited to have you join us as we release the findings from the 2026 API Voter Survey, Insights to Inform a Year of Action. Joining me is Karthik Ramakrishnan, who is also the Executive Director and founder of AAPI Data. So as a reminder, this webinar is going to be recorded. All the resources, including the webinar recording, will be posted on our website, and you can submit questions throughout the webinar under the Q&A mode. So let's go ahead and get started. Wanted to provide some background information. This year, as we head into this election cycle, 16 million eligible AAPI voters are there for us to engage and to turn out. And throughout the last 15 years, AAPIs have continued to grow its electoral share every year. Now, growth alone doesn't tell the whole story. Asian American Pacific Islander voters are growing at the same time that many consequential elections are being decided by narrow margins. In states like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, API voters have the potential to exceed the margin of victory in closely contested races. That means increasing participation can have a meaningful impact on who wins the elections. On the next slide, you'll see is that both Asian American and Pacific Islander turnout to 40% in 2018 and remained at 40% in 2022. That's a 13-point increase that was fully sustained through the next midterm. For Pacific Islanders, turnout increased from 37% in 2014 to 43% 4 years later and was 41% in 2022. While slightly below the 2018 level, turnout remained 4 points above 2014, suggesting that much of the earlier gain was sustained. So the question heading into 2026 is whether we can sustain and build upon that higher level of participation. Now, the survey goals that we have is to really understand Asian American voter attitudes, priorities, and their plans heading into the 2026 midterm elections. In the crosstabs, you can dig deeper and focus on differences across Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and demographic groups. Overall, this is to help us strengthen our voter participation and provide actionable data to inform voter education, outreach, and mobilization strategies. As a key point, surveys help us understand what voters think, but more importantly, understand what that means for outreach and mobilization, the work that we all need to do. The disaggregated data shows different needs and opportunities across communities. Now, a little bit about the methodology. We were able to design it to reach over 2,066 API voters, which this time also included 170 Pacific Islanders. This was conducted in mixed mode approaches using phone, MMS to web, and online recruitment from June 3rd to July 27th. And overall, this methodology was to produce population representative results. As we move on to the key findings, I want to go ahead and start off with in regards to the voting plans, right? Right now, what we're seeing is that what stands out is the level of intention in a midterm election. The 90% who plan to vote is higher than the comparable midterm figure in both 2018 and 2022, but intention is not turnout. Certainty also varies substantially by ethnicity, which tells us 90% shouldn't be interpreted as uniform engagement across communities. For those of us doing voter engagement, our job is to make sure that people who intend to vote actually have the information and support to make a plan, to cast a ballot, and have it counted. For civic participation, Pacific Islanders adults prefer some traditional forms of civic engagement. 21% attended a local government meeting compared with 13% of Asian Americans, and 20% made a political contribution compared with 15% of Asian Americans. Contacting an elected official was actually quite similar. 21% Pacific Islanders versus 19% Asian Americans. I think we're on the civic participation slide. And younger adults are more likely to engage politically through digital channels. 32% of adults ages 18 to 34 posted about politics on social media, compared with 19% of those 65 plus. 34% discuss politics on group messaging apps, compared with 20% of those 65 plus. What jumps out isn't typically that 75% discuss politics. It's the drop between political conversation and other forms of participation. That creates an organizing opportunity because people are already having conversations. How do we essentially turn those conversations into action? Group messaging is particularly interesting because it allows us to equip people to reach the family and friends they already talk to and trust. So I do want to go next in terms about political fatigue. High engagement and fatigue are occurring simultaneously. Now, younger voters stand out as particularly politically fatigued. Adults ages 18 to 34 report substantially higher exhaustion and lower enthusiasm than voters 65 and older, even as they remain politically engaged through social media and group messaging. Now, for those of us doing voter outreach, that raises an important question. How do we engage younger voters without adding to the political fatigue that they're already experiencing? For example, we need to meet younger voters where they're already engaging. Younger adults are more likely to discuss politics through group messaging and social media, so create information that is useful, easily shared, and designed for those spaces. On the next section about political exhaustion and mood, exhaustion doesn't mean disengagement. 90% still plans to vote, and 75% have discussed politics with family or friends. When addressing voter exhaustion, we need to respond with useful, trusted information. Trusted messengers, people who have built relationships with voters, become especially important when moving people from information to action. When voting feels manageable, not overwhelming, we need to focus messaging toward concrete actions like check your registration, know what ID you need, decide when you'll vote. Is it early, mail, or election day? Find your polling place. How are you going to get there? Date and time. Or is it time to actually return your ballot? Each communication should give voters one clear thing that they can do. And then with this, I will go ahead and turn it over to Karthik Ramakrishnan from API Data.
Thanks, Christine. One second. Okay. Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you for your engagement with this survey for the last several years. And when we get, Christine's already pointed out some important findings when it comes to political interest and civic engagement. I'm going to go through vote choice, policy priorities, and some other important issues in the election. And then Christine will come back to talk about news consumption and trusted messengers. So when it comes to vote choice, bottom line, API voters favor Democratic candidates over Republican candidates when we look at it in the Senate or the House. Now, the Senate, only about a third of the seats are up. So part of that difference that we see is also a function of the states that are holding Senate elections this year. The Democratic advantage extends across most Asian American ethnic groups, with some exceptions that we will point out. Let's go to the next slide. So when you look at vote choice for House races, a pattern that we see here that we've seen in other surveys, not necessarily of registered voters, but API adults, is that Asian Americans tend to have a stronger Democratic lean than Pacific Islander populations, and we see that here as well. But overall, the Democratic Party is doing much better than the Republican Party, where the gap is the least among Asian American communities is among Filipinos. This is something that's important to note because we typically think of Vietnamese voters as the most split in our communities. But in recent surveys and in recent elections, we've seen Filipinos approaching that status as well. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of Senate races, again, a reminder, it's only about a third of the states that are holding Senate races this year. California, for example, which is a major state for both Asian American and Pacific Islander populations, does not have a Senate race. So the results, part of the difference in results reflect that. So if you look at the Filipino results, for example, essentially it's an even split between Republican and Democrat. That does not include the majority of the Filipino American community in the country right now, because some of those very large Filipino states are not holding Senate elections this year. So it's just something to keep in mind. Let's go to the next slide. So in addition to what I mentioned about the Senate races and about Pacific Islanders, strength of candidate support is similar, although there are some differences by age. Those who are older tend to have stronger support for the candidates that they're backing than those who are younger, which you'll see in the slide deck and in our report on our website. Let's go to the next slide. So I'd already talked about the strength of candidate support by age. You see that at the bottom there. Party splits also vary by age. This is not surprising, and we see this in other instances, but it's good to see what it looks like for registered voters as opposed to API adults. That's another thing I'll just mention is a key feature of this survey compared to other surveys, including those that we have done with organizations like NCAPA and the Associated Press. Those are surveys of API adults, regardless of citizenship status and voter registration status. This gives us a closer look to the election and a more accurate snapshot of what the registered voter population looks like. Next slide. In terms of policy priorities, cost of living and inflation, this issue has dominated over ever since 2024. Even in 2024, it was the top issue, remains so today. Healthcare is also very high, and you see the other issues. Now, you may be surprised when you see issues at the level of 90%, 82%. Well, here we are combining those who say that the issue is extremely important and very important. If you go to the next slide, this shows only those who said extremely important. And there you definitely see a separation between cost of living and inflation and the rest of the issues. Healthcare is an issue that has not received a lot of news coverage recently. Got a lot of coverage in November and December last year with people's premiums spiking because of lack of reauthorization of subsidies. There's a lot of anxiety about the loss of coverage in Medicaid coverage as well as other aspects of healthcare coverage. So this in some ways is a sleeper issue. I say that because we're not seeing a lot of news coverage on it, but we know that our community says that this is a very important issue. This graph also shows differences by age. So some issues like Social Security and Medicare are very important, extremely important, right? Technically, in the way this question was worded, for those who are 50 to 64 and 65 plus. But for those who are in younger age groups, look especially the 18 to 34 population, jobs and unemployment and education are also top tier issues. So this is important for us when we think about disaggregation to not only think about ethnicity, but also age, which is a critical factor in terms of issue prioritization. Next slide. So in terms of how are we to make sense of policy priorities, we have additional data in our disaggregated data. You can find that at API data right now. You can also find it at API Vote after this webinar. There are some differences. I've already talked about differences by age, but there are also some differences by race in terms of where Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans stand. So, for example, on war and foreign policy, higher priority for Asian Americans than for Pacific Islanders, and also for gun control. Next slide. Next, in terms of policy preferences, we asked two sets of questions. One was about voting rights and voter access, and we see very strong support for voter protections in different ways, including state governments being required to notify anyone whose voter registration has changed or marked for removal. We know that this is going to be a big problem in several states across the country. We also see very strong support for the notion that the right to vote by mail should be guaranteed for anyone who requests it. We also see very strong support for language assistance, as well as Congress passing a law that bans federal law enforcement, including the FBI and immigration enforcement, from appearing at election sites. Now, the prospect of that legislation is close to nil, but we see where our community is at in terms of how seriously they're taking threats to voter access. Next slide. In terms of other issues, we also asked questions about immigration and about the care economy. And we find that our community is generally progressive or more left-leaning, however, whatever the terminology one wants to use. Immigration enforcement agents should be required to wear body cameras. We found strong support for this among API adults. We see very strong support for this among API registered voters. We also see major prioritization for Congress to pass policies or ensure that Social Security is protected and to pass stronger legislation to provide support for unpaid family caregivers. Next slide. Now, this support varies to some extent across communities, generally speaking, and you'll see this in our disaggregated data. Pacific Islanders tend to be progressive, but less so than Asian Americans on many of these issues. And another trend you will see is that younger adults are more progressive than those in higher age groups. That said, this is variations on a theme. So it's rare to find younger registered voters and older registered voters on opposite ends of an issue. It's the strength of how left-leaning they are that you see that varies by age. Next slide. In terms of which party they trust more on doing a good job on these issues, what you see here are various issues, and they are ordered by the priorities that I had talked about earlier, right? So cost of living and inflation at the top, and then other issues that fall below that. On issue after issue, a consistent pattern emerges where our community, our voters, trust the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. And that strength and that gap varies, but it's there throughout. Another pattern to note is about a third say that neither party uh, is doing a better job on the issue. And so that represents a persuadable population, but also a population that needs to be reached out to, not only in the electoral context, but in the policy context more generally. Next slide. So this in text basically describes what I had said when I showed the graph. Note that on crime and public safety, the gap is narrower, but also note that crime and public safety is a relatively low priority issue for our communities compared to other issues like cost of living, healthcare, jobs, and unemployment. Next slide. We also see some differences by age, and you'll find more of that in our disaggregated results on our website. We also find important differences by party identification, as well as the Asian American and Pacific Islander distinction that I've mentioned earlier. Next slide. So in terms of favorability, we asked favorability in a few different ways. We asked about Trump. We also asked about Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress. We also asked about your own member of Congress. For Trump, he's viewed unfavorably by 70% of AAPI registered voters. And that's a finding that is fairly consistent over the last year among AAPI adults. Republicans in Congress are viewed unfavorably by a pretty significant margin, although that unfavorability is less strong among Pacific Islanders than among Asian Americans. Democrats in Congress receive more mixed ratings, and you'll see that in the report when you download it, as well as in the crosstabs. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, in terms of persuadability, what we did is we replicated a survey experiment we ran in a survey, the 2025 Policy Priority Survey with NCAPA. And what we did is we asked about key elements in HR 1, which is the reconciliation bill that had significant implications both on taxes as well as spending, including on health spending. So let's go to the next slide. It also had important provisions on spending for immigration enforcement that are locked in for the next several years. So we asked 1/3 of survey respondents about their opinion on congressional action that only mentioned the benefits in the bill. Another third only received information about costs or negative aspects in the bill. And then finally, another third was exposed to both benefits and costs. This is called a survey experiment to see if there's any difference between those who are only exposed to messages that talk about the good things in the bill, or those only exposed to bad things in the bill, and those exposed to both. And what we find is dramatic framing effects. Those who are exposed only to benefits in the bill are much more likely to view it favorably. And this effect is especially pronounced among younger adults and those who identify as independent. If someone is exposed to both the costs and the benefits, their opinion is about the same as if they were exposed only to the costs. So we were curious to see if this still remained true a year later. Let's go to the next slide. And we find that these framing effects are remarkably still present. What this means is those who get to our communities with a one-sided view of the bill is more likely to hold an advantage. What this also shows is that our community is still likely unaware of key elements in the budget reconciliation bill. So this is a huge gap in persuadability that is largely related to a knowledge gap in terms of key actions that Congress and the president took last year. This is something that's going to be critical when it comes to voter engagement so that voters are fully informed about the consequences of prior elections as well as the consequences of this election. Next slide. So I'll just draw your attention to the bottom of this slide. Key takeaways: voters remain persuadable because their awareness of HR 1 is likely low, and costs weigh much more heavily once respondents are presented with the full picture, right? So you don't see much of a difference between those exposed only to the cost frame and those exposed to both the benefits and the costs. Let's go to the next slide. terms of voter outreach, we've repeated questions that we've been asking since 2012. So let's go to the next slide. As before, we find that most of our community members, actually not most, so about 40% of our community members have not been reached out to at all. Some groups have done a better job than others. So the Democratic Party has done a better job than the Republican Party, and community organizations are on par with the Democratic Party in terms of whether people have been contacted by community orgs. Now, one thing we did differently this year is to dig deeper to see to what extent are community organizations contacting people that are already being contacted versus contacting people that have not been touched by the two main parties. So let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the one after this. So if you look to the very right, so all of these percentages, by the way, add up to 100%. So if you look at the column where people have not been contacted by either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So by the way, that's better than 40%. So I misspoke there. So it's about a third of our population has not been contacted by either party at all. Out of that 33%, 8% have gotten contacted by a community organization. So community organizations are filling a critical void where our registered voters are not being contacted by the parties. Now, we still see 25% of our registered voter population not being contacted by anyone. And so we know that we need to have a lot more resources when it comes to voter outreach, both on the partisan side as well as the nonpartisan side, to make sure that our communities are informed and engaged leading into the midterm elections. Next slide. So with that, I'll toss it back to Christine, who will take it over for the rest of the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karthik. So we're going to go ahead and talk about news consumption. You can see here that how fragmented the news environment is. There really isn't one place where we can expect to reach API voters. Television leads at 47%, but YouTube is close behind at 43%. And newspapers, news sites, and Facebook are each at 35%. Now, language also matters. While 78% mainly consume news in English, more than 1 in 5 consume at least some news in another language. Among foreign-born correspondents, that rises considerably, with 23% consuming news in both English and another language. The next slide, we're going to look at this in terms of variation by age. Age changes the news media landscape dramatically. Television use rises from 32% among 18 to 34-year-olds to 68% among those who are 65 and older, while the pattern is actually reversed for platforms such as Reddit and TikTok. Now, among younger adults, 30% regularly use Reddit and 31% use TikTok for news. Now, this reinforces what we see in the civic participation data. Younger adults aren't necessarily disengaged. They're engaging differently. They are more active through social media and group messaging, and they're also consuming news through a different mix of platforms. We can't reach a multi-generational electorate with a one-size-fits-all communication strategy. The message may be the same, but where and how we deliver it needs to reflect where different communities and generations are actually getting their information. On terms of trusted messengers, now family and friends rank at the top, not celebrities or influencers. So all of you have more influence than anyone else. Pacific Islanders place especially high trust in community serving organizations. Now, combine this with civic engagement finding. If people are already discussing politics with family and friends, our job is to provide those trusted messengers with accurate information that they can share. So with that, with this information, the next steps really for us is that the challenge isn't simply getting people interested. They're already intended to participate. The challenge is turning intention into turnout. For an exhausted electorate, communication should make participation easier, not just louder. Reach people through the messengers and channels they trust, provide useful and in language information, and tailor outreach rather than treating APIs as a single electorate. And importantly, don't build this infrastructure only for November. Use this election to strengthen relationships that carry into the next cycle. So, with that, with voter enthusiasm, API Vote and our local partners have an opportunity to build on that momentum by closing the outreach gap, reaching the API voters early and often with trusted in language information, and making sure that they have what they need to actually cast their ballots. API Vote can provide the national infrastructure, data, tools, and resources, but it's really our partners who bring that work into our communities and make it real for the voters. Our partners, people like you, know their communities. They know the languages voters that speak, the issues that they care about, and how to reach people who may never hear from a campaign or a political party. Now, that local trust and those relationships are what allows us to turn information into action. So at this time, let's go ahead and bring on some of our local partners, specifically, from Nevada and Georgia to hear their reactions to these findings. We have Yui Win, who's Vice President and COO of Asian Community Development Council, and Murtaza Khwaja, who's the Executive Director for Asian American Advancing Justice Atlanta. I'll turn it over to the two of you for some of your quick reactions to this. And Yui, I think? Yes, great. Thoughts, guys? Yui, you want to start us off?
Sorry, my audio button didn't want to cooperate with me. Right. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Christine, for that. Um, Asian Community Development Council, we are celebrating our 12 years of operation here in Nevada. And when we first started, the Asian community electorate was not anywhere on the map, as no one talked to the API community here in Nevada because they don't think we actually vote or get engaged in the process. And therefore, for many electoral cycle, we are the missing margin of victory. And as you all know, the rise of API voters in 2026, where we have said in the slide deck that 90% of registered API plan to vote in November of 2026. But I think that is something that we still have to work more in terms of making sure that the cost of living is the top priority and top messaging in the conversation that we're having. The trusted messenger for us is still a huge key item because most Asian American community feels more comfortable with talking to their loved one, family conversations, their healthcare provider, as well as their religious leader. So those are some of the try and true methods that ACDC over the last 10 years have continue to work on and making sure that our community is completely in the loop, as well as making sure that they are educated on the topics at hands.
Great. Thanks, Yui, for some initial thoughts. Let's go ahead and hear from Georgia.
Thanks, Christine. And yeah, huge thanks to API Vote and API Data for putting this together. This is really helpful data, I think goes to affirm a lot of the things we've seen here in Georgia. Obviously, Georgia has been a really dynamic state for several election cycles now. And in 2024, while we did see APIs turn out more than they did in 2020 and be a higher electorate share, there were several that didn't vote. And when we canvassed in 2025, a lot of what we heard is they didn't see themselves reflected in the ballot. What we've seen across the country is a whole huge slate of candidates emerge out of AAPI communities, and also ones emerge maybe not necessarily from the community, but spurred on by a lot of the same things that API communities are concerned about: rising cost of groceries, inflation, and just affordability writ large. And so I think a lot of the information we see here affirms a lot of that, what we're seeing. And we're also seeing candidates that are coming a lot more from our communities, which explains, I think, this 90% of APIs being excited to vote in this upcoming election, despite feeling exhausted, despite feeling the voter fatigue. I think that goes a long way to show that despite the policies we've seen continue to come out of this administration that either marginalize our communities or that exclude them, or actively are antagonistic towards them, we're seeing communities organize, we're seeing groups organize in a way that we'll see meaningful change in this election, where we'll have an electorate that is a lot more engaged about how they're being excluded, how they're being marginalized, and really a whole slate of candidates that are going to be more reflective of them come November. So I think that's really great data to share. I also very much appreciate that there's been more PI representation in this survey as well. And I think that the disaggregation of data, which obviously Pan-Asian organizations, we struggle with this because it's such a large group of people we serve. It's it's from Turkey to the Pacific Islands. Pacific Islands themselves are not a monolith. And you've got West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think the disaggregation of data when possible is really helpful. And so seeing that separation between PI communities and Asian Americans has been helpful as well. Because going back to what Dewey and what you all have shared, the trusted messenger, it matters so much, and having someone who's representative of those groups or reflective of those groups is going to vary. It's not going to be the same person or the same group for every single community. It's going to be a host of organizations, a host of community leaders, both the grass tops and the grassroots, that continue to send on the message. So I think this has been really helpful data, and it's a really helpful survey that you all conducted. So very appreciative of y'all for doing that.
Wonderful. I think we're going to keep you and Yui on, and Karthik is going to also join us back on for our Q&A. As a reminder, everyone, if you could use the Q&A function to ask your question, that helps us consolidate everything. Maybe Karthik, could you maybe level set a little bit more about the methodology? If you could explain what languages were included, and what is
Absolutely.
a
Yeah.
multilingual survey?
Yeah. So, whenever we do surveys in our community, of course, if we had a lot of resources, we would get even more populations covered, because you need to have a critical mass of each population to be able to break out their numbers, and also more languages. But where we get to something approaching at least 80% coverage in our community is language support in the two major Chinese dialects, as well as Korean and Vietnamese. So those are the languages supported. It was also important to do the survey not only online, but also by phone. Because when it comes to language support, people need to go the extra mile, right? When it comes to having it more of a conversation on the phone rather than a self-administered survey. So that's how we went beyond what we typically do, for example, at API Data. And so that's something that's, I think, important to know in terms of not just the populations that we surveyed, the methods used, and the languages supported. I know that there were some questions that also came up in terms of state-by-state breakdowns. Again, if you had larger budgets, you would have enough sample sizes in each of these states to be able to do it. We are able to do major region breakdowns, and that's something that we will support API Vote in the future to have updated analyses. But the bottom line, I would say, is age and party ID are huge factors. And even when you look at independents, they tend to be more Democratic leaning when you drill deeper on their party identification, and even in their policy preferences and favorability, they're closer to the Democratic Party than they are to the Republican Party. So that's something to keep in mind when we think through all of this. And I'll say this as a researcher and expert. This is for educational purposes only that I'm saying this, and not any encouragement to any particular party.
let's go keep in line in terms of methodology. Oh, there's a question like, how are you encouraging participation and responses to surveys? I want to engage the API community, sharing their stories by filling out surveys and sharing their perspectives, but understandably encounter a lot of apprehension to things like text or call surveys, given the financial fraud schemes also happening through these modalities.
Yeah, so what I'll talk about our surveys and would love to for our community partners to talk about ways that they gather information about their communities, right? So these phone calls they make and face to face are important kinds of evidence they gather. For us, there are different things. Low survey response rate is a problem in the survey industry. One of the ways that the survey industry has tried to counter that is to create panels where you have repeat survey takers and they know that who they are. And there's even panels, there's a difference between high quality panels and low quality panels. Recently, there has been instances of fraud when it comes to online surveys, including with panels. I'm on the Amplify API NORC panel. This is one of the more expensive panels, but it's a very high quality panel that ensures that these are humans that they have recruited through intentional postcard sampling methods. So that reduces the likelihood of fraud. But there are other ways, and that's where I've been very pleased to see community engagement partners not doing full-blown surveys, but asking questions in their voter contact engagements to gain more intel in the community. So I don't know if Murtaza or we, if you have anything to say on that.
Well, I said earlier, in my comment about trusted messenger, and I think that feels very true to nonprofits that are in the community and on the grounds because we do face-to-face surveys, and that's always more effective than phone call and text messages because, like the question was asked, that there's a lot of fraud and a lot of rampant, misinformation out there. So people are ignoring their text messages and phone calls is because they don't want to engage in something that they have no trusted source in terms of verification on. So, for us, because we do direct service like food assistant and health navigation and education programs, we ask those questions doing those interaction because they already see the name, they trust our organizations. We're there 365 days a year. We're not just coming out for a survey every time there's an election or every time, even, when we're talking about the census, right? Those are programmatic things that people don't see on a day-to-day basis. And so if they have a point with an organization that has been there every single day doing the actual work, that cover the basic like healthcare and food and a roof over their heads, then they're gonna be more likely to share their information with us. So, organizations and different research group, including, academic institution, gone through us because they know our programs are reaching to those who, will be able to be comfortable sharing those information versus over the phone or text messages.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, one question for you, Murtaza, just to switch gears a little bit. There's a question is that isn't it already illegal to have federal law enforcement at polling places? Because I know you guys are dealing with those type of scenarios. And then this part B of this question is, can you tell us why you include that question about new legislation and how that was worded? That's for Karthik.
Yeah. So it is illegal. However, this administration has pushed the bounds of constitutionality and legality to way past, I think, anything that's been precedented. And so, scenario planning around federal law enforcement at the polls is not only just recommended; I think it's necessary in this time. We had our gubernatorial candidate here in Georgia talk about how the governor is going to have National Guard there to preserve the election just a couple of days ago. It could also be other forms of federal law enforcement. There's a lot of interest in Georgian ICE being at the polls, and as well as potential other DHS enforcement agents, as well as potentially just FBI. We've had FBI raids on election institutions here in Georgia as well, just in the past 12 months. While there's supposed to be federal protection against that, the reality is similar in other situations. When the bounds are pushed to a certain level, we really see how flimsy a lot of our institutions are, and so we are doing a lot of scenario planning around that. And at the end of the day, it's also just not at the election site, it's also in community. And so during early voting or in the weeks coming to early voting, if there's increased immigration enforcement in communities of immigrant communities or communities of color, that's also going to have impact on turnout come election day. But all of those scenarios are possible. There's been active conversations by people like all the way to the very top in Georgia to the governor, who said that he's interested in having National Guard being present at elections to preserve the integrity of the election. So I think we would be remiss just to think that current law would be enough to protect ourselves. And that's not just in the API community, that's in Black communities, that's in other communities of color. So we're working in a coordinated fashion to make sure that our election protection apparatus encompasses all these different threats and has the ability to respond, whether it's with emergent litigation, direct legal support, or poll monitors right there who are able to report on what's going on immediately. So that's a big part of our work this year, and things that people are doing statewide and nationwide is having that election protection apparatus that is a group of local, hyper local groups, sort of statewide groups, and then also national partners that are able to address all these different threats that we may see on election day.
Yeah, and also just to plug in, just remember there's the AAPI vote hotline that will provide in-language support in 9 languages plus English. And this is all tied into the greater ecosystem for election protection, including lawyers that will also be on the ground. Okay, going to the next question. How do AA and HPI voters' behavior and our opinions differ compared to the general population? Are there data points where our behavior and opinions deviate significantly compared to non-AA and HPIs?
Yeah, so
I
just
guess
quick. Oh, sorry, just quickly on that. I mean, it's in just for the survey, and I know we're running out of time. This survey is only of APIs, but we've done part of our partnership with the Associated Press and NORC is we can make general population comparisons. And an important finding there is, say on immigration, people think that the pushback on immigration enforcement is strongest among Latino communities. No, it's actually strongest among Asian American communities. That's what you get when you get these comparisons. Cost of living, of course, matters for everyone, but in our survey in December of 2025, we saw that it was a higher concern among Asian American and Pacific Islander communities than the general population. So good question. You won't find it in this survey. And I know, Christine, there are a few other things I'll say. Some questions, just in the interest of time, please look at our report and the detailed crosstabs. For example, there's a question about unified versus divided control of government. You'll find it. Generally, people want divided government. Unless you're a Republican, you want unified government. So party ID is a strong predictor there in terms of where you stand. But our population in general, because it's Democratic leaning, wants divided government rather than unified government right now.
There's also a question about gender differences or culturational, generational level, because I know we weren't able to dig into some of that.
You'll see, I mean, we have a couple of slides you'll see when you download the report. Definitely they're in our crosstabs. Gender differences are not as high as you would think, but there are some instances. So if you look at the key findings in the report when you download it, you'll see in a couple of instances where there are some gender differences. Generational, you see it, we have it by nativity, but really the big thing I would again emphasize to you is age as a key predictor in terms of generational differences, more so than nativity.
Switching over to mail-in voting. The news said that there's a presidential executive order issued to limit mail-in voting. The Guardian News speculate that the next move would be to freeze elections by declaring a national emergency, so it would become much like Ukraine, where elections are paused due to warfare. How do we protect democracy in this scenario? I know Nevada utilizes a lot of mail, so maybe one of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, Christine, that has made headlines quite a bit here locally in Nevada in terms of the executive order. But I think even with that particular incident, our Secretary of State has already confirmed that that executive order will not affect this coming election in November of 2026 because everything is already underway. So that will be just right now, just sensationalized through the different outlets. But in terms of our mail-in ballot, which has been in our books for a few cycles already, will not be affected by it. So we are continue to advocate for that and making sure that people are not being misinformed because that will be affecting turnout. And because we are a trusted messenger in our community, we're continuing conversations that say, hey, you know what? There are multiple way to vote, and none of that has been taken away. And that's something that we are continuing to do on the ground.
I think that's a great message. I think that's the right role for trusted messengers, similar in Georgia, in terms of at least currently it's still an available way for people to vote, even if it's curtailed currently. I do, and not to be an alarmist or not to, I do also want to stress that we are living in unprecedented times where things are being challenged in a way that they haven't been before. And while there are protections in place, once that's pushed, we've really seen our democracy be more flimsy than I think any of us anticipated. So even in these extreme cases where we're talking about there being a national emergency issued, whether however likely that is or not likely, I think that's a different matter. I think the fact is that it is at some level a possibility. And that's not to be an alarmist, that's to be a realist in that this administration is acting in a way that is unprecedented and things are happening in a dynamic way. This administration is also benefiting off a lot of misinformation. And so for groups preparing for the absolute worst, it takes away resources and it creates confusion. And it also creates fear in communities that chills their ability to vote, whether or not they follow through on what the most extreme case would be. So I say all of that to give a little comprehensive picture of, while yes, people should be informed about there are safe ways to vote and they should be counted that way, we are living in a dynamic time where things are more delicate than they have been in the past, and we would be remiss to not acknowledge that.
Yeah, the quick thing I just want to add in this context, and Christine and I and other organizations have been talking about this quite heavily, right? In terms of how do we make sure that people are not deterred from voting through this kind of chilling effect? So I think there's a certain kind of conversation that organizations and community activists need to be prepared for. But I think it's on us to steward this responsibility in a way that people do not feel that fear and intimidation and confusion. That
That's
would be the
why,
yeah.
yeah. And I think that's why it goes back to the role that we all have to play. It went back to the that friends and family have the most influence and are the big push that we're making sure that people think about is like, how can you start discussions now about what is your
Everyday health, everyday grocery items, fuel, and housing, all these things matter, and they depend on the time of the year in which we asked it. But generally speaking, housing and health are kind of the main drivers of where our community is experiencing the pain. And also remember, like when you look at the geographic spread, of course, we have communities in Georgia and other kind of areas that have grown a lot. But even in Georgia, they're in places that have unaffordable housing now. So our communities tend to live in metro areas that either were always expensive or have gotten very expensive. And so that's a concern in addition to health costs. I can't emphasize that enough. This is a major driver of costs, and it's getting more expensive because of policy decisions that have been made. And it's important for people to know that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Murtaza and Yui, for representing the perspectives of on the ground. I encourage all of you who are interested in getting activated. API Vote is here to connect you with our local partners in over 30 states. We are, doing everything. The next big activation is National Voter Registration Day, as you can see from my background. So we're just trying to encourage everyone having those conversations with your family and friends and activating out in the community to register voters before the deadline is up. As a reminder, this will be this data, the recording, all the crosstabs will be on the website as well as emailed over to you. And I will hand it over to Karthik for any remaining last closing remarks.
Yeah, no, just gratitude to API Vote for leading the AVS, right? And now especially to add Pacific Islanders. It's been with all the suggestions people have on improving our data collections, we hear you and we're trying the best we can. I'm just proud that we're at this moment now that we have enough representative sample of Pacific Islanders to be able to make it an API survey rather than just an Asian American survey. And yeah, it's going to be a very consequential election, and I hope that these insights can be helpful to our partners in ways to make sure that our communities are informed and engaged. And I guess that's what I'll leave you with. Many of us are such political nerds or policy nerds. We're following the latest on everything. Big chunks of our community don't even know what the budget reconciliation bill did. So let that sink in. And that's the task at hand over the next couple of months to make sure that people understand that prior elections have had consequences and this election will have major consequences as well.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a good day.